The young and the restless, youth and restlessness, the Newmans versus Cain tension in Genoa City had always simmered beneath the surface, but now it threatened to erupt into full-scale war as Victor sat in his study, staring at the family crest etched into the mahogany table, the weight of the Newman legacy pressing down harder than ever. He wasn't merely concerned anymore, he was angry, calculating, and preparing for a campaign unlike any he had launched before. The name Cain Ashby had become more than an annoyance. It had grown into a dangerous entity, an infection threatening to bleed into every inch of the empire Victor had spent a lifetime building. With the Chancellor estate already on Cain's radar and whispers surfacing about his designs on Newman Enterprises and Newman Media, Victor knew that a storm was coming, and only a united front could stand against it. In a private gathering inside the Newman Tower, Victor called together those he trusted: Nikki, ever steadfast and perceptive, already aware of Cain's ambitions toward Chancellor; Victoria, whose business instincts had never dulled; and Adam, always teetering on the line between loyalty and self-interest. Victor spoke with conviction, warning his children that Cain was no longer operating as a lone disruptor. He had become a strategist, a man who viewed the Newman dynasty as ripe for dismemberment, piece by piece, company by company. Victoria, razor-sharp and unflinching, began tracing Cain's moves on the real estate chessboard, seeking patterns, acquisitions, any sign of where his next strike might land. Adam, more cynical and agile in his tactics, proposed embedding someone inside Cain's operations, a shadow move that mirrored his own past sins. The two siblings, so often rivals, found themselves, for once, aligned in purpose. Not because they trusted each other, but because the threat outside the family had become more perilous than the battles within. Victor listened, nodded, and made it clear, this wasn't just about protecting the family name. This was about legacy, control, and the refusal to let an outsider walk off with the crown jewels of the city. But what they didn't know, and what haunted Victor more than anything, was that Cain wasn't simply targeting Chancellor or circling the edges of Newman Media. He was coming for everything. Newman Enterprises, the very company that carried Victor's identity, his philosophy, his willpower carved into every boardroom decision and corporate acquisition. And more than that, Cain had already started sniffing around Jabot. The audacity of it, striking at the heart of two empires simultaneously, wasn't just bold, it was deeply personal. Cain wasn't looking to build something new. He was looking to devour what others had bled to create. And in the midst of this corporate chessboard, another name hovered in the shadows: Phyllis Summers. A woman too savvy to be manipulated, too damaged to be underestimated, Phyllis had begun hearing whispers, not from the boardrooms but from behind closed doors. Cain had confided in her, or at least pretended to. He hinted at a backdoor offer from Jack Abbott himself, a possible deal that could redirect Cain's appetite away from Jabot and fully onto the Newmans. It was a tempting prospect, and Phyllis knew exactly what kind of man Cain was. If the price was right and the advantage tangible, he could be steered. But even as Phyllis pondered how to use this information, she couldn't help but ask herself the question everyone feared. Why would Jack Abbott, who had suffered deeply from Cain's reckless actions in France, even consider aligning himself with such a man? The answer, as painful as it was clear, came down to the ruthless logic of war. Jack wasn't forgiving. He hadn't forgotten the loss, the chaos, the betrayal. But in the calculus of pain, there was something more pressing than justice: survival. Jack had been at war with Victor Newman for decades. The rivalry wasn't just personal. It was institutional, woven into every boardroom meeting and corporate merger. And now, with Victor preparing to unleash hell against Cain, Jack found himself facing a twisted choice: stand alone and be swallowed by two titans, or make an uneasy alliance with one to take down the other. Cain, for all his sins, wasn't Victor. He didn't have the deep-rooted legacy, the influence, the patience to wage a slow war. He wanted results, and Jack, seeing Victor's insatiable hunger for dominance rising once again, chose what he believed to be the lesser of two evils. He would work with Cain, not because he trusted him, but because he knew what Victor was capable of when he decided to end a rivalry once and for all. This fragile alignment set into motion a series of unpredictable consequences. Nikki, who had always been Victor's compass, began to question whether drawing lines in the sand against Cain might trigger a larger implosion across Genoa City. She knew the price of war, and she sensed Jack's fear. It wasn't loyalty to Cain that was guiding him, but desperation. And desperation, Nikki feared, could infect them all. Meanwhile, Victoria pushed harder into her investigation of Cain's holdings, uncovering shell companies, off-the-books acquisitions, and a quiet but aggressive move into key sectors that had once been secured by Newman affiliates. Cain wasn't moving erratically, he was moving like a man who had mapped out every possible counterattack and was waiting for the Newmans to act first so he could strike back harder. Adam, watching from the sidelines but never idle, began to wonder if Victor was underestimating the psychological warfare unfolding. Cain wasn't using traditional tactics. He was planting seeds, manipulating old rivalries, using emotional wounds as leverage. He was weaponizing people like Phyllis, exploiting Jack's grief, and keeping the Newmans so focused on defense that they forgot what they did best: offense. And while Adam admired the strategy, he also feared its implications. If Cain could destabilize Jabot and fracture the Newman alliance, he wouldn't need to take anything by force. The city would fall into his lap without a single hostile takeover. And that, more than anything, made Adam nervous. But Cain had his own shadows to wrestle with. Despite his forward momentum, the past clung to him like smoke. There were rumors swirling from France, whispers of unfinished business, of legal entanglements buried under layers of paperwork and non-disclosure agreements. And some said the ghosts of those he had crossed, or worse, still walked beside him, watching, waiting for their moment. Cain pretended not to care, but the weight of it all, the need to prove himself, to crush Victor, to outmaneuver Jack, to bend Phyllis and neutralize Adam, was beginning to fray the edges of his control. In the silence of his private office, Victor stood staring out at the Genoa City skyline, his reflection faint in the glass. He could feel the war brewing, sense the tremors beneath the surface. This wasn't just business. It was personal. He had fought bigger enemies, more dangerous foes. But Cain was something different, an outsider who had studied the game, learned the rules, and now sought to burn the entire board. And Victor knew, with absolute certainty, that the only way to defeat someone like that was to strike first, strike hard, and never miss. As the days passed, the battle lines blurred. Alliances shifted like sand. Jack grew more entangled with Cain than he intended. Victoria began pushing Newman Media to pivot into aggressive acquisitions as a counterstrike, and Phyllis found herself caught between loyalty and manipulation. Adam, never one to play safe, began courting his own sources, possibly even setting traps within traps. And through it all, Cain smiled, confident, assured, playing all sides but loyal to none. Because in the end, he didn't want to win Genoa City. He wanted to own its soul. In Genoa City, where every family secret was a currency and every alliance a weapon, the battle lines were shifting again, this time not over corporate takeovers or boardroom betrayals, but something far more personal: love, timing, and the unrelenting expectations of Victor. While the Newman Empire faced external threats from Cain's calculated march across their legacy, Victor found himself consumed by a newer, more intimate kind of rage. The unraveling of trust between Kyle and Claire. In Victor's world, loyalty wasn't something you claimed, it was something you proved, repeatedly, under pressure, in crisis, when everything else was falling apart. And from Victor's perspective, Kyle had failed that test when it mattered most. Kyle, believing he had done the right thing by resisting Audra's relentless seduction, had hoped his restraint would earn him Victor's reluctant approval. He had not kissed her. He had not led her past his defenses. He had stayed true, at least physically, even when Audra had thrown herself at him with all the subtlety of a grenade. In Kyle's mind, that had to count for something. And more than that, he had finally started to feel like he was navigating out of the fog that had clouded his emotions since Claire entered his life. He was trying to show that he could be strong, dependable, a man worthy not just of Claire's heart, but of Victor's trust. But none of that mattered now. Because when Claire needed him most, when her father, Cole, lay on the brink of death, he wasn't there. He hadn't left because of an emergency or because of an impossible situation. He hadn't left at all. And that, to Victor, was the betrayal. Kyle had been told about Cole's illness, had been made aware of how fragile the moment was, and still, he stayed where he was, mired in indecision, tangled in his own reluctance. It wasn't Claire who asked him to stay away. It was Audra who urged him to go. And still, Kyle had stayed. It was a failure not just of action but of judgment, and Victor saw it as a personal insult. The man who wanted to stand beside his granddaughter hadn't stood beside her at the one time it truly mattered. Claire, however, had not inherited her grandfather's fury. She had inherited something far more dangerous, his determination. When the family gathered at the Newman estate for a strategic discussion that was meant to rally them against Cain and shore up the family's unity, Claire was notably absent. Victoria noticed first, and her heart dropped not out of fear, but out of exasperation. She knew exactly where her daughter was. She didn't need a tracking device or a phone call. She had seen it in Claire's eyes hours earlier. The unwavering need to go to Kyle, to be near the one person who had broken her heart simply by not showing up. Victoria warned her, of course. She reminded her that Victor would see this not as a romantic gesture but as a declaration of war against the family's expectations. But Claire didn't blink. She was past caring about appearances. She was done playing the good granddaughter, the quiet strategist. She wanted Kyle. She wanted to hear it from him. Why hadn't he come? Why did she have to walk into her father's hospital room alone? As Claire walked through the quiet corridors toward Kyle's suite, Victor's anger was already beginning to manifest at home. The moment he realized she was not coming, not picking up, not standing beside the rest of the family as they discussed the most dangerous threat to their future in years, his fury became volcanic. He didn't raise his voice, not yet. But his silence, taut and humming with disappointment, was deafening. Nikki tried to soothe him, gently suggesting that Claire was grieving in her own way, that perhaps she simply needed space, that young people didn't always respond the way he expected them to. But Victor was unmoved. In his mind, this wasn't about grief, it was about weakness. Claire had always been his protégée, the one who absorbed his lessons, who saw strategy where others saw sentiment. And now, because of Kyle, she was slipping. She was walking into emotional chaos, and worse, she was doing it willingly. It was a betrayal not just of Victor's expectations but of everything he had tried to instill in her. Nick, ever the voice of reason, suggested that perhaps Kyle deserved a second chance. After all, he hadn't betrayed Claire in the traditional sense. He hadn't been unfaithful. Maybe he had just made a bad call. Victoria agreed in part, although her own emotions were tangled in maternal concern and business instinct. She knew Kyle. She knew his flaws, but she also knew the pressure of being on the receiving end of Victor's judgment. She feared that if Victor turned his full attention on Kyle, it wouldn't end with a warning. It would end with destruction. But Victor was already past the point of listening. His mind had shifted into war mode again, only this time, the target was not Cain Ashby, or Jack, or any of the usual enemies. The target was Claire's future, and whether or not it could survive this distraction. Meanwhile, Claire found herself standing face to face with Kyle, her eyes searching his for something she wasn't sure she'd find: remorse, understanding, maybe just a whisper of regret. Kyle stood, silent at first, unsure of how to begin. He had played this moment in his head 100 times, imagined what he would say, how he would justify not being there. But now, with her in front of him, pale and exhausted from hours beside her dying father, all the words vanished. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just asked one question, why? And Kyle didn't have an answer that would save him. Back at the Newman compound, Victor made a decision. He would no longer tolerate distractions. If Claire was serious about Kyle, then Kyle needed to be tested. Not just emotionally, but publicly. He would put Kyle in a position where failure would be catastrophic, where the consequences of weakness would be visible to everyone. And if Kyle failed, Victor would ensure he never stood beside Claire again, not as a partner, not as a husband, not even as a footnote. Victor wasn't interested in sabotaging their love. He wanted the truth. And if the truth was that Kyle couldn't stand the weight of Newman expectations, then he would be cut out completely. No warning. No second chances. And Jack, ever the reluctant warrior, began to see what was coming. His son was about to be caught in the Newman machine, ground up between expectation and failure. And while Jack had once believed that the alliance against Victor was a necessary evil, he now saw it as a poisoned chalice. Cain was dangerous, yes, but Victor was relentless. And if Kyle became collateral damage in a war between empires, no one would walk away untouched. As the storm clouds gathered again over Genoa City, the lines between personal and political, between love and war, between family and betrayal, began to vanish. Claire had chosen love. Kyle had chosen hesitation. Victor had chosen judgment. And now, the reckoning was coming, not just for Kyle, but for everyone who dared to believe that love could be stronger than legacy.